So yes, this is a topic I've been working on for a long, long time. And you might see this as my utopian project. I have projects in which I try to look at what goes bad in the world, so corruption, abuses of power, the dark side of humanity, if you like. But this is the light side of humanity. This is my main constructive topic in my working life. Is sort of, well, how can we improve the institutions that we have? What kind of future should we aim for? How should that work? And the well-being angle is my do-gooder project, if you like. Right? And this is basically, I want to talk today about how far we are now on that do-gooder project, which in a sense has sort of been shared with many over the centuries. Right? I just see myself as one of the people holding the torch in this generation, but it goes back centuries, this notion that we want to go to a society which is oriented towards the happiness of the population, instead of other things we care about, like money, power, or a religious doctrine, or whatever it is. Right? So it's a bit of a utopian project, but I am one of these people who tries to make these things real, and so work through the practicalities of stuff. And so I'm going to tell you about cost benefit, social policy, the environment, and the well-being. And the well-being, as I'll explain to you, is basically a notion of well-being years of life, happy years of life. And it's different from the quality, which is a health notion of life. So, let's have a look. This thing doesn't work. Yes, content. So the content is essentially some of the basic ideas developed and applied in this list of stuff that I sort of brought out the last 2 years. And I think the top one is the main one. That's sort of a handbook for well-being policymaking. We brought that out late last year. This has sort of been adopted by the UK Treasury and now also by New Zealand as sort of the blueprint of how they would want to work with some twists. And this is really, that's sort of the amalgamation of 5 years of work at the LSE. So when people tell me, well, what did you do in London? I said, look, that's what I did in London. Right? And a lot of that work was actually also based on what I did here. So there's also a reflection of ARC grants that I've been given here and the long line of stuff. Okay. And so the way I will introduce this is to talk about something that I've only become aware of maybe the last 8 years or so, which I didn't really know before. I should have, but I didn't know before. And it made me think a little bit differently as to how well-being could be brought into our governance. And the way, what I want to talk about first is hence what actually is cost-benefit analysis is used by rich countries. Right? I mean, most of you will have been taught cost-benefit analysis in your undergraduate degree, and it's set up as this kind of wonderful method in which you know fully how the world works, and you can figure out all the costs and benefits in all states of the world and have an expected value of what that looks like, blah, 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 right? Now, if you believe that that's how the world works, well, that's how cost-benefit analysis in reality goes, you've been fooled, right? That is a sort of a religious representation of what actually goes on. And it's important to have a sense of what actually goes on, because if you're in the religious realm, you won't get anywhere. So the main cost-benefit analysis, as I would describe it, used by rich countries, including Australia, including New Zealand, including Britain, including France, including Germany, at least in some of the departments, is that they estimate how various outcomes, YK, and that could be a lot of stuff in the YK, that could be GDP, but it's usually is much, much smaller, because we're thinking about projects with 10 to 20 billion, you know, a bridge, a new social policy. So this could also be mental health, it could be kids going to school, it could be crime rates, whatever it is, right? How they will change with the mind delta YK for a relevant population. That's often how CBAs go, some kind of initiative. They figure out, well, we think that's the relevant population, and their outcomes we think will change by that much, and they will have different models for every YK. It won't be a single model, right? So forget about the single model world, in which we know how the world works, and it's all integrated, and it's all a consistent whole. No. Different models lead you to different YK. So we are already talking about, you know, deep inconsistency baked in. So they estimate various YK due to the delta and examples, crimes, park visits, and then you try and put a dollar value on that, right? A PK value on that. And that PK preferably comes from market prices. So if it's about number of park visits, about, well, here, what do they pay for a park visit in whatever place? If it's about crimes, well, you know, some measure of what people would be willing to pay not to be in crimes, right? And if you talk about the future, then you want to discount it somewhat, and different countries actually have different methodologies, but you can then discount it, right? So they preferably look for a market price or something that comes from that line of thinking, which is willingness to pay, which is What do people, if they stand back, think, well, I'd be willing to pay this? And you try and elicit that in various ways. Right? And then you add them up. And you basically say, well, that's the benefit of a policy. So you sum over these Ks, all kinds of different models, the delta YK, right, times the PK. You don't really deal with uncertainty. You pretend to. You have a low scenario, high scenario, but CBA analysis doesn't really deal with uncertainty. It's too hard, effectively. And policymakers can't think in uncertainty. So you present them with, this will be the benefit. That's roughly how it goes. And you compare that benefit with an estimated financial cost of a proposed policy. And the estimated cost can be changed tax rates, it can be the upfront costs of a bridge or of a park. It can be also changes in all kinds of amenities, so it can be the changes in how much health services are taken care of or how much demand there is for education. So you've got a cost, you've got a benefit, right, to the government as a whole, and it's all monetized. And then you work with them. So you can see, well, the benefit minus the cost, that could be the net present value of the project. You could go C over B, the cost benefit, B over C, cost effectiveness, right? So you play with that. And it's important I'll give you an example of what this looks like in practice, which is a good example, I think. But I like to give commentary. One is that you should see it as an attempt to be rational, right? It's not quite rational, but it's an attempt to be rational by a bureaucracy. They try to sort of follow the notion of we should figure out what the effects are of the changes that we have in our world, right? So, and in a simplified way, it's always about a trajectory of choice A versus some status quo. So you're always comparing two things, and usually the thing you're comparing to is a status quo. And it nearly always, particularly when anything big, it glues together estimates of various relevant outcomes to different groups at different times. So you are looking at different models, different frames of mind even to come up with these different YKs. So you are talking about a sort of a wide, trying to blend worldviews together in order to, as it were, put enough in a leaky bucket which has enough of the value in it of whatever it is that you're proposing to do. So it comes from multiple models. That's important because it means you should let go of the notion that this is a single model of the world, that it's rational, or anything that you were told in undergraduate. Right? Forget about that. This is a heuristic. This is an actual used method. Hundreds of times per day across the world. This is how it goes, right? And so they rely on many rules of thumb, right? Stylized models, simplified alternatives, views of the world. And I didn't know this, but those views of the world differ by country. They differ by department within country. So, the Treasury would use different models, different views of the world to the Department of Transport, who would use the different models, different views of the world to the Department of Education. Within the Department of Education, it is, the lifetime education modelers would do it different from those who come from sort of child pedagogy background. Right? They'll put different things in there. So you are much more looking at a kind of a whole swarm of people trying stuff, right? And so that makes it hard to judge, right? It's not the religious stuff. It's all kinds of people doing stuff that they try to be consistent within their own view of the world, but that view of the world it differs all the time, right? And so then you have to make a stylized statement on that, right? And the stylized statement that I'm willing to make on that after 5 years seeing 7 departments up close is that what dominates in this is sort of the 1980s view of economics. It's about economic surplus and willingness to pay. They are the big components which go ultimately into those prices. And I'll give you an example. This is a good example of what happens, and it's also a good example of the politics of it. So this was a valuation of, I think, the third runway at Heathrow, done by UK Airport Commission. This was the Airport Commission, was by the Department of Transport. However, this was a captured commission, so effectively they were run by the Swiss company that runs Heathrow, and so you're basically looking at a kind of paid piece of stuff, but it's presented as if it's a government report itself. And that will explain to you some of the weird stuff that goes into it, right? But that's the policies of it. So this is sort of captured corruption. And they have 2 lines, 2 columns of numbers. Each of these numbers are sort of in billions, and you can see that these are sort of the things that they care about. They care about consumer surplus, producer surplus, and consumer surplus is where if you've got more runways, you can have more planes, and so you'll have more travel trips. And so there's more consumer surplus because you're pushing the supply line out to the right. And an interesting thing to say is that this is a huge number, right? 54.8 billion, all discounted. But the reason they get a number as huge as that is because they effectively presume that the prices would go down of airline tickets, right? For the calculation of the consumer surplus. However, deep in the report, page 120, after the main analysis, it's revealed they don't think the price will go down at all. They think the price will go up, in fact, otherwise you can't make money on this. So this consumer surplus is pretending as if the company which is paying for this research is going to lose billions of pounds on this, all for the generosity of the public. And that's what allows them that number, right? And the producer surplus would go down by 38 billion. So this is the company that wants this Heathrow runway down and says, oh, we're going to lose 38 billion, right? I mean, it's bollocks from here to there, right? But that is the nature of this kind of corrupt game that is being played, right? And so and these are economic modelers, right? PhDs in economics, and you could get sort of sucked into this kind of game as well, right? So you produce a huge number, right? And you basically make whatever assumptions you need to make to get these kind of ridiculous numbers. Government revenues and their delay, wider economic impacts is basically what they think is attractive business. And then some stuff, biodiversity, well, they didn't know how to handle that, so they put in 0. And then all these things are things they didn't know how to handle. So well, we think this will be positive, and it's green. We think the community will be bad, because, the runway is displacing things, there's more noise, place is probably bad. So we think it's going to be negative, right? But look at the total benefits, 69.1 billion, and that's mainly that consumer surplus, which the actual expectation probably close to 0. But that's in page 120 in the appendices, so the people who wrote it can say, look, we've got everything in the report. Yeah, but it's not in the main table. And remember that number 69.1. This is pretending that they'll do carbon capture, but they don't take that seriously themselves. Okay, and then they have a support conclusion like this, and on the basis of this conclusion, in the British Parliament, the third runway was pushed through, right? So this is a paid-for piece of research that had real-life consequences. That third runway is going to happen, right? And so the conclusion is, by the Airports Commission of the Department of Transport, against the objective of maximizing economic benefits, so, okay, that's a special thing now suddenly, supporting the competitive, it'll generate 69.1 billion of benefits, of which hence 54 is made up, right? But more importantly for our purposes, there's lots of zeros in there, stuff that's just too hard. And of course, these other things all come from different models, right? So their noise model is not the same as their consumer surplus model, right? The scheme CapEx comes from a totally different kind of calculation than either the noise or the consumer surplus model. So you can see how already different models glue different numbers together to come at a table like this. And there are literally hundreds of tables like this produced every day on different stuff, right? So, okay, they say 69.1 billion is a benefit, and where did all the green and red stuff go? Well, we haven't got a number. Didn't have a model, so we didn't know how to do it. So let's do it simple. Just presume it has no value. I mean, that's much less effort, right? I mean, imagine having to deal with something as nasty as biodiversity, quality of life, community. Can't do that. No, that would be extra effort. We haven't got money for that. Let's just stick to the real economic stuff, right? Which we make up. So this is the reality. Yeah, but you laugh, but this is the reality of cost-benefit analysis, right? A capture, which is sort of normal in the whole of sort of government transport now throughout the West, particularly, of course, in Australia. And this sort of focus on sort of economic-looking numbers, but also these habits, right? You see the habits in there, that they focus on economic surplus as the way to get big numbers. Okay. Now, note particularly that what is not monetized, what is not measured, does not show up in the final conclusions and recommendations. That is huge. That is huge. That should discipline your mind as to what you ask of another measure if it's not willingness to pay. That should discipline your mind as to, well, what do I want from a well-being measure? I want it to be less shit than this. You stop worrying about whether it's perfect. You start worrying about whether it can do better than this. That is a huge point. So, problems with CBA as usual. Well, many things of greater value are not things people pay for, so they don't easily show up in willingness to pay or market prices. You could if you put in a huge effort, but usually the effort is not made. So people value their children, but there are a few who pay for them, or their partners. They love having lovers, but they don't know how to buy them. People value their mental health, but they don't know what it affects them, so they make systematic mistakes, and they don't know how to buy it either, right? There's lots of unbought mental health stuff. People value public goods like the environment, but they're not traded. It's notoriously hard to get a reasonable number. And so, as you saw with biodiversity, let's just presume it's zero. People value friendship, but they would be offended if you asked them, well, how much is this friend worth to you? You know, it's almost unfriend-like to put a monetary value on that kind of relationship. So that's one problem, right? Greatest values are not things people pay for. So willingness to pay measures don't pick that up well, and they're easy to criticize. So usually they're not valued. Whereas this is often what people care for most. You know, what have we got there? We've got kids, partners, friends. Geez, what is life about if not that? The second thing is consumption externalities and limited awareness. So consumption externalities by design not in market prices, because these are the effects on others. So if somebody's jealous of my Lamborghini, well, that's not my problem. In fact, maybe a reason for me to buy this Lamborghini. But, and it's not in the market price of the Lamborghini either, right? But it's a problem for someone else. And from the social welfare point of view, you want to count that, but it's not in willingness to pay or a market measure, so we don't count it. Unlimited awareness, which is this systematic mistake stuff. So systematic mistakes, and we know people make systematic mistakes for mental health, but think, for instance, of anti-smoking campaigns. It took the government 40 years to convince the population that smoking was bad and passive smoking was bad. So that was a situation of 40 years. The government thinking we know something the population doesn't know, we've got to convince them. So systematic mistakes. People were not rational. And there are many other such examples. And you think, well, okay, well, science should tell us what then works and what the population is not convinced. That's fine. You can have sort of a whole system, and the government does that for many things. But that, in principle, is not in these cost-benefit analyses. This notion of irrationality and systematic mistakes is not in there, which is a little bit strange, because if there are no systematic mistakes and irrationality, you wouldn't need government at all for most stuff. Right? You wouldn't need a sort of a scientific endeavor to find out stuff. People would already know. So essentially, the problem is that money is not the ultimate measure of value, right? To become more scientific and inclusive, we must do something else. So they don't know how to value social life, mental health, or the environment, and the solution to that by most CBA modelists throughout the world is to just say they have no value. That way you don't need to model it, it makes life easy for you, right? So unless you explicitly adopt a measure of value that's easily related to these things, social life, mental health, the environment, they will continue to not matter in CBAs, right? You can jump up and down about any measures, oh, it's not perfect, this and that. That's not relevant. You are then on the side of classic CBA. You're then on the side of saying social relations don't matter, that doesn't matter. Right? If you're not into this kind of, well, what's a better measure, and then we'll go to another better measure, then you're not in the game at all. And for instance, the Sustainable Development Goals are a beautiful example of, as it were, a diversionary tactic. Although it's not meant as a tactic, it's meant seriously, but that makes it worse. So there are 17 of them, and there's 900 odd individual indicators, most of which are totally gameable and systematically wrong. And guess how useful they are for CBA? Something that has 900 dimensions. Utter useless, right? So when people say, oh, we should take the Sustainable Development Goals, which many countries have, that's another way of saying, we're not going to take any of that seriously by flooding it so much with a huge dimensionality which we can't deal with. So various countries have adopted Sustainable Development Goals, but their bureaucracies are still doing classic CBAs, because when it comes to these departments, they look at these 900 dimensions and say, well, stuff that, right? We don't know how to deal with that. Nobody knows how to deal with that. So we're just going to ignore it. And so in reality, it's ignored. So you need something simple. Okay, so what's the idea of the well-being? That's sort of well-being but then applied to this world, if you like, right? So you're in the tradition that you want government to maximize happy years lived. And if you do that, you can value anything that makes life enjoyable. And consumption externalities become easy because it becomes an empirical question. How much does your well-being go down if I buy a Lamborghini and I park it in front of you? So it's about length of life and quality of life, right? So the length of life is still in there, it's well-being years of life. So in terms of your previous calculations, if you're used to quality calculations or CBA calculations on length of life, not much changes. But the quality of life now becomes well-being quality of life. And the quality weight is going to be how satisfied people themselves say they are. And we've come to interpret that more as a vote on what they experienced, rather than sort of reflecting some sort of internal util calculus, which was the old way of looking at it. Now we're thinking of it more as a vote. You don't ask of a vote whether or not there's more utils of one vote than another, you just add them up. So that's what we're now doing, we're just adding them up. So what is the UK life satisfaction question? There are different subtle varieties over different places, but this one has been asked systematically of all government surveys ever since 2011. The question goes, and you can answer it for yourself, but silently, please. Overall, overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? And the 0 is not at all, and the 10 is completely. Now, it's interesting to point out a couple of aspects of this question which make it a life satisfaction question, so that you know what to look for. Right? One is that there's usually some word in there which indicates the whole of life. So it could also be the ladder of the whole. Right? So it could be, thinking about your life as a whole. Right? And in English, the word overall captures that. Right? And then it's sort of, we're asking for an evaluation of you. How satisfied are you? And the thing that the evaluation is going to be asked about is life. Right? And life nowadays. Now, note this is deliberately not specific about the timing. So for a normal util guy, you'd sort of want to say, between last week and now, or between last year and now. But that's not how people think. So this reflects that people think more in terms of how am I going in life? And for me, that could be, if I'm very myopic, a question of days, or for somebody who's far looking, it could be a question of years. So in a way, it is more a running score of your life. How am I overall going on this long-term trajectory? Should I change anything or not? That's sort of what you're thinking of, you're picking up. It's a similar question if we ask others, are they happy or not? Then we are thinking of, how are they going on that barometer? And what is then the Wellbeing? The Wellbeing is derived of this thing, right? So it's a 1 unit of life satisfaction on the 0 to 10 scale. So now the scale matters. So if the question is between 1 and 7, then that 1 unit is not one Wellbeing, it's more like 1.4, right? So it's on a 0 to 10 scale, 1 unit of life satisfaction for one person for 1 year. So we've made this thing accountable, and we basically just declare it a comparable unit. So this is the thing we add up across people. This is the thing we add up across time. And some of the key statistics on how you can play with this, right? One is that we know that a normal level of somebody who's very healthy is about an 8. That'll be true in Australia. Right? So if I know you're very healthy and I know nothing else about you, I'll give you an 8 on this life satisfaction score. So that's sort of the bound, if you like, for a healthy year of life if your quality is 1. Now, then there's the question, well, what is the level at which you think, right, I don't really want to live anymore? Or if you offer me another life with an extra 10 years of life, but it would have to be lived at a life satisfaction of 1 or 2 or 3, would you still be willing to have this? No, I'll forego those extra 10 years. Thank you. Now that has been investigated, not very well, so this is an uncertain number, but the best measure we have at the moment, P-score et al., they actually took a suggestion I put in my PhD, 1999. They went basically asked people this question, suppose we give you an extra 5 years at the end of your life, but it would be at this level, would you actually want them? And at the round 2, that's the switching point when you start to get more than half who say no thanks. So let's say it's 2, right? UK Treasury has adopted 1, which they think is conservative, but I just think it's too low.
Can I interrupt? The way the question is worded suggests that we are tapping into some people's state of mind at a particular point in time. Whereas, second point, the measure of well-being appears to be some sort of flow concept. We talk about a certain amount per person per year. So how are you going to reconcile the two?
No, that's true. It's well observed. This is, in principle, treating it as a flow concept, whereas that is an evaluation of what both has forward-looking elements into it and backward-looking elements into it. And furthermore, we'll have a time horizon that differs by people. Right? But there are 2 points to make about that, right? If I measure you often enough, then the time horizon that matters for you could be very short, very large, doesn't matter. I'm going to pick up your average evaluation of this thing over your whole life anyway, whether you're myopic or not. So that's point number 1 to say on that, which is that it starts to look like a stream anyway. The second thing is that we are just using this, much as voting is, which is also, as it were, a momentary snapshot, but used to decide things on, to say, okay, we're happy with this situation or not, we're going to change the decision makers. We are using this as a decision criterion, right? Basically declaring the evaluation, whatever it is, as our better measure. Okay, but let me go on between the 8 and the 2, because if very healthy is 8 and the indifference point is 2, then you say a year of life is 6 well-being. Now that is a very powerful thing, because we know a shitload about life satisfaction. We've got 200,000 studies since the 40s on this thing. This is one of the most researched questions in social science. We know an awful lot about this thing. Right? But that also means that we know roughly, what is more important to you and how important it is to you. So I can trade off things, right? So I can say to you, well, a marriage is probably worth at least half a year of life. And how do I know that? I know in the year of marriage, you're probably 0.8 higher, but you're already 0.5, 0.3 higher the 2 years previously. Then you go down, and before you're at the adaptation point, you might have 3 whole well-beings more because you got married. 3 whole year, 3 well-beings, that's half a year. So I start to have a means to trade off the length versus the quality. And I have a means to trade off quality in all kinds of realms. Because anything that affects this thing is then comparable. So I know how important mental health is versus physical health. I know how important it is to have money for the individual versus how important it is that their kids have high physical health. I know how important a local garden is versus that I know whether or not they feel they have choice behavior with regards to their marriage partners. So effectively, we start to have an empirical measure as to what values really matters to individuals and even communities, but it's always harder to say something more definite about communities. And so this becomes our tool to say, okay, this is the unit of value that we're going to plug into these CBAs. So what do we then do with these CBAs? Well, then the government is going to maximize the expectation of, right? And you only look forward because you only care about what happens from now on into the future. There's a bit of discounting into the future, and there's argy-bargy about what might be in there. You have the social weight of the individuals. Now, you shouldn't think of this as some individuals are more important than others. You should think more of this when it comes to practical CBAs and saying, well, that guy's got 3 passports. So it's really only 1/3 Australian. That's small, or doesn't even live here anymore. He's an Australian, but hasn't lived here for 10 years, never votes. Should he count at all? That's the sort of thing where the social weight would matter for. And then what you're doing is you're saying, well, okay, their life satisfaction number minus that 0 point. Right? So this then allows you to play with life and death. That's what they're adding to the well-being stream, if you like. Right? So this becomes your maximand. And just as with regular CBAs, you never actually measure this maximand. You don't have to. Right? CBAs is about how this thing changes if you do something versus not. So most of this thing is subtracted always. Right? So you're only looking at estimated changes, right? So in calculations, you use predicted changes in the life satisfaction of a particular group from a policy relative to the status quo. And you use the best causal estimates that you can find. Now, 30 years ago, our causal estimates on life satisfaction were pretty shit. We had very little solid causal estimates. But nowadays, we're getting a whole flood of experimental data, natural experiments, long-run experiments, right? We're getting a pretty good handle on using basically standard economic causality type methods on this life satisfaction question. And we've got policy variation with introduction of GPs, for instance, in Turkey. We know mental health programs for villages in Bangladesh and Pakistan, fully randomized. We've got stuff on lottery winners, fully randomized. I mean, we are starting to get a pretty good handle also on this in a sort of regular causal sense. So as I said, there are 200,000 studies. This is one of the most studied questions in social science. So that also tells you this is a whole group, right, rather than that. And so in a way, this is also what we have to offer the government bureaucracy, which is we're offering, as it were, a methodology which comes with a huge amount of background information. Tony?
So how does this vary from set-point theory?
Well, we basically don't need at this point to make any theory as to the dynamics of others. Right? I mean, set-point theory doesn't work well for life satisfaction. So for those who don't know, set-point theory basically says that people are born happy or unhappy, and it's sort of a deep personality trait which is set fairly young in life, and then they always come back to that, right? Now we effectively think that's just not true. We think that somebody who's been unhappy for 5 years is perfectly capable of being happy 10 years later. So we don't think that people are sort of miserable throughout life. Not that. Yeah, that basically the set bit is not very large. Let's prove that. But in a way, that's irrelevant to this. Whether that's true or not, that's an empirical question. So that's an empirical question as to how much you can shift life satisfaction permanently. And if you believe in set point theory, you can't shift anything permanently. But we, for instance, know that marriage does shift life satisfaction permanently for men, not for women. The marriage shifts it for women, but being married for men. So, right? Women love to get married, men like to be married. Okay. Now, those CBA calculations, well, of course, we still don't have a model of the world of this thing, right? I mean, I've not told you how the world works. I've just told you a measurement instrument of value. So you still have the same procedure previously. You've still got all these different models to work out your YKs, right? That in effect doesn't change. So and the huge diversity doesn't change either. So that's the same procedure, but the PK is different. That's where we've now got something else. That's now in terms of well-being effects of unit. And then you can decide on different policies on the basis of how much well-being per unit of public funds to buy. And we know that the weighting in the well-being of both social life and the environment and mental health is far higher than it is in traditional CBA. So the problem with the traditional CBA, which I sketched to you, which is hence that social life is not in there, the environment is not in there, mental health is not in there, that is suddenly reversed. Those things become front and center, right? Particularly social relations, which is sort of a key bit, which is basically outside of almost any CBA. We just don't ask of CBA, what does this do to friendship networks? You know, does this mean that people interact with each other in a happier way? Are the communities then more stable? We don't ask this in normal CBAs. You now start to think of that first. That starts to be your first question. What does this do to community life? And often the answer is nothing. Communities self-adapt. You know, there's not much you can do. But that is then what you start to be cognizant of, and the examples whereby that's not true. So what is that well-being cost effectiveness, which is basically one of the decision-making rules, right? So in a simplified way, the well-being decision-making rule starts to be that you compare the net benefits of a policy, now all in terms of life satisfaction, so the well-being, public costs, this is again any sort of monetary effect anywhere in the whole system, so you think of the whole system of government. If that is above a particular cutoff point, then you say, okay, we fund it. Where does the cutoff point come from? Well, you basically fund whatever is most cost effective until you run out of money. So this thing is basically where the public budget runs out.
So, oh, sorry, I lost you now, because the benefit before was not on P, on value, or monetized, it was on well-being.
Sure.
But the denominator is still on P.
Yes, so it's because this is an allocation of government budget rule. So the benefit now is well-being. So the benefit now is that is no longer money, that is well-being.
Right. So right. The benefit is in well-being.
Benefit is in well-being. Exactly. No longer monetary term. The cost is still actual cost of a government system.
So how can you compare the denominator, numerator, and different values?
Yeah. You could try to do it in well-being terms. You could. But as it were, it's more practical to think of the costs of the whole government system in pounds, because that's the way the government system operates. The government system operates in terms of taxes, in terms of allocating budgets of money. It doesn't allocate budgets of well-being. And so we're looking at a budget allocation decision.
Yeah, but I don't understand the lambda.
Okay. The next slide hopefully makes that clear, right? Let me go to the next slide to hopefully make that clear where that then comes from, because the lambda is endogenous. That's the point. Okay, so these cost-benefit analyses are difficult, right? And they cost a lot of effort. So this is one we did for our handbook, and that took us quite a while. And so you see 15 programs on this with a cost-benefit analysis. Now, each of these bars basically represents a shitload of work. Right? So lots and lots of calculations, lots and lots of uncertainty, lots and lots of models and different groups and different places. But they have different cost-effectiveness estimates. So, and then we group them from low to high, right? So in your question, where does it come from? Well, the width of these bars is basically how much money you have, right? So if basically your public budget is somewhere on this line, then the moment it stops, it gives you your lambda, right? That is then how you can see it. You fund from left to right. That is the essential idea. And now, what is some of the most cost-effective stuff which makes you money? This is the IAP, the Improved Access to Psychiatric Therapies. It's helped over 1 million people in the UK already. Must be 2 million by now. They basically make you money. It's because you give them cognitive behavioral therapy, which is dirt cheap to give. It's highly effective. I saw just a program last week in Bangladesh whereby it had a huge effect on depression rates, and the costs were $30 per person. Right? Absolutely nothing. and it was given over the phone. I mean, this stuff is dirt cheap and it has surprisingly long-term effects. I mean, it's kind of like, why don't we do this all the time? So, IAPT, mental health, and why does it make you money? Because if people have less problems with mental health, they're more likely to keep their job, they're more likely to be at their job rather than at home, ill, and so they give you more taxes. You get it back in taxes. And the other thing that it gets you back is that if they have higher mental health, then they're less worried about their physical health problems and they don't show up at hospital all the time, right? That's another big thing, right? So they don't sort of overflow the national health system. Now that's your Pakistan mental health intervention, which is similar to the Bangladesh one. It's basically females in villages in Bangladesh. This was a 7-year study. They followed them up 7 years later after a cognitive behavioral therapy intervention, which is very similar hence. And they still found that these women were far better off and were looking better after their kids as well, and the household finances were better. This is Healthy Minds, that is teaching in UK high schools, which has been evaluated. That was a huge government report. That's basically the same IAP, but then slightly different assumptions built in there. So we're now no longer thinking of even counting the physical health NHS effect. This is an air pollution thing. Right? Air pollution is now starting to be recognized as more important than we used to think it was. We didn't used to think air pollution in cities was that important, but we're now finding out that it has small mental health effects. But those small mental health effects go for millions of people, so they add up. And they're not mental health effects that people themselves are aware of or would believe. So air pollution in cities is starting to be the new passive smoking. Right? It's more important than you'd think it is, than people believe it is. All that is priced in markets. Okay, action for happiness. So this is another CBT type thing, but then only counting certain things. This was a commercial thing. This was keeping agendas in Qantas, in fact. Natural lottery well-being programs. They were cooking lessons. So this was an attempt to build communities. US health insurance. So that was actually an experiment before, after by whole states, which was sort of introduced for parts of the population. So we know how beneficial health insurance is, and it's immensely beneficial. This is NHS marginal, and so the dotted line represents one of the major, well, the major health program in the UK. So that's basically 80 billion per year spent on that. And why is it important to do that? That could be your benchmark. Right? You basically say, look, this is what our current health program buys us. Anything that's more cost effective than that, we should pay for. Anything less, well, why don't we just give it to the NHS? So this is an existing program, and this is the best estimate of it. But note that this is not willingness to pay. The willingness to pay for NHS marginal is probably 10 times higher. This is productivity of the NHS. This is how many lives they save for pounds. So for £2,500, the NHS managers say they can buy a Wellbeing, which is effectively saying they can buy a Quali for £15,000. And the Quali is 6 Wellbeing if it's 5 years of life. So that's where that comes from. Now, Human Henge, that's having people running around Stonehenge. The London Olympics, you basically are buying national pride there for a few months. So it's quite expensive, but still okay. Willingness to pay nice, so this is how much they pay for medicines in the UK. You probably should stop doing that. This is trying to look after the homeless by giving them a house. That's been spectacularly unsuccessful, so that doesn't help them at all. And so that's why they have this huge thing. And so this is where your lambda can come from. Okay. And so now what we're on, and I only thought a little bit about this during my PhD day. So part of the ideas you see before I had during my PhD days, but part of this is new, is that much more thinking in terms of systems and institutions, right? So the Wellbeing is now being adopted in the UK Green Book, which is their Bible for how civil servants should argue for policy money, right? So this is how they internally have to beg for money, then have to use the Wellbeing. Or at least that's one of the techniques they are now allowed to use, perhaps a better way, right? The New Zealand CBA guidelines have now also included it, but it's the start of a trajectory, right? To truly institutionalize well-being cost effectiveness needs a whole lot of stuff. Right? So let me tell you something. Right? One is a general price list, which is, well, if you're going to have lots of effects that you come out of different models on unemployment, on divorce, on crime, whatever it is, then you want a simple number telling you how much well-being is that, and you want to look it up if you're a bureaucrat, right? You've got to make it easy for you. So you need general price lists. Now this is something that science doesn't do. We don't come up with price lists because we all argue. We want our numbers to be in the price list, not somebody else's number. So we fight about this. Scientists don't come to a consensus number. That's not how we work, right? So the general price list is something in there, and that's what bureaucracies have, and they already have general price lists, but just not on well-being, on sort of health. Complement substitute. Can I take that question later? Because that's a general question. Okay. So the general price list, let me show you, right? That exists, right? I mean, we generated several price lists. This was at the behest of the Wellbeing Center, WhatWorks Center for Wellbeing. I put up the first price list, and now they've got a whole process for generating more price lists, right? So we're now generating price lists, right? And things that bureaucrats want to put in spreadsheets, right? Doubling of household income, extra year of compulsory education. We use a natural experiment in that. From single to partner marriage, from partner to separated, no commute to an hour commute. So things they care about, things that have to do with the transport system, that have to do with unemployment and wages, right? So that's one of the things to institutionalize it so that they can look things up, right? You're basically feeding a machinery of tens of thousands of civil servants throughout the world, and they need a price list because they can't figure out how the world works. It's far too hard. Oh. Can I go through this list and then take questions on that? Okay. Now, the second thing is that you need well-being frameworks and models in each major policy area, right? So remember how I said every department has its own view of the world and does things? Well, that's for good reasons, because there's huge specialism in each department. And so the view of the world that you need to understand education is usually different from understanding transport or social programs or arts or sports, right? And so you need to develop well-being frameworks, these large models in each major policy area, and that needs people to maintain it, right? And the Institute for Fiscal Studies is one of the places doing that for unemployment and the budget, right? These take a lot of time to develop, and the models we now have in place in the various bureaucracies in the world represent thousands of years of academic and sort of analyst thinking. That would then have to start to be replaced or overcome or augmented with well-being models. Now, I can't supply all of those. I can't do thousands of years of thinking in the handbook, but we've done a bit of that, right? So, this is one of the models we had, a nice whiz-bang, and it's got forward-looking, backward-looking, it's kids, intervention in kids, and we've got the parents in there, and well, you can imagine programming this up, and we did program this up, and you can imagine what a dragon that is, right? But that's just one of the many things that you would need to feed these bureaucracies, and that needs an army of analysts, right, to sort of do this and to understand it. You need to have groups in here which are not able to fill in this life satisfaction question. That's something you need, right? Who can't fill in the life satisfaction question? Well, people who are not capable of self-evaluation. Who's not capable of self-evaluation? Yeah, kids, if they haven't got this sort of external notion of who they are, and people who have lost the ability to self-evaluate, like demented elderly, right? That's why they need care. They need care because they no longer are able to view themselves externally and hence look after themselves. So you need to do something for that, right? You need to plug in a measure or some sort of rule of thumb for that, and that is not yet been totally done. Then to institutionalize this, well, if you're going to have these thousands of analysts sort of redoing normal CBA and well-being terms, you're going to teach them these methods. So you're going to have an internal training program. That's happening now in the UK a little bit. In New Zealand, they're doing that. But that needs to be set up. There needs to be a budget. There needs to be, institutionalized methodology, and that's, of course, is partly what the handbook was for. You need generalized information on how to measure well-being, how to compare different measures over time, what the current belief is the set point theory, what we now think we know about the world of work, what we think about young kids, what we think about volunteerism, what we think about community. That is now happening, right? So the WhatWorks Center for Wellbeing is doing that stuff, right? So generalized information, they basically are world suppliers now for generalized information and well-being. There must be a report every month, and they've operated for about 5 years now. So there's an awful lot, and there's all kinds of tools and questionnaires that you can download for free. And of course, you're going to encounter problems, right? Of what does one department do that affects another across countries. Inherently difficult areas whereby you don't really have a population you're servicing, like say the army, right, which serves some sort of notion of national safety. That's going to be a tough one. Things like internal operations, like the audit office, right, something that doesn't have an obvious constituency that you can estimate stuff on. And so you're going to have to deal with those problems. So you have to have a system of inquiries, workshops, white paper, and that sort of thing. And that too is now coming. 10 minutes, that's fine. You have a question?
Yeah, I'm not so sure if you're going to measure people's happiness.
Life satisfaction, yes.
Life satisfaction, yeah, right?
Yep.
In the question, you are assuming that people are telling you about something that you are measuring. But in fact, you are making an assumption that they are interpreting the question and assessing a particular program or activity in the way you assume.
Not really. No, I'm not asking them to sort of, rate a particular program or a particular aspect of their life. I'm only asking them, in a sense, to rate their own life, the one that they are living. And so, in a sense, I'm asking them about the thing that they know best. But again, remember when I said I treat this as a vote on how they're going in life, right? That is how I now treat it. And so, in effect, I'm maximizing the number of positive votes here. Right? That is the setup. And don't forget, the preamble, the question is not, is this perfect? No, it's fine. I can critique this all night long. That's not a problem. My grandmother could do that. It's not interesting. The question is this better than what it's intended to replace? And so that's the conversation we need to have. If we're not into the, is this better than what it's intended to replace, we're not having a conversation. Then we're talking religiously. There's this measure up to some internal notion of perfection. And that's how we used to debate well-being. But that is totally stale. We should get away from that. We should be in terms of systems, right? As to whether or not, is this a useful way to go? Will this actually do something? How can you game it? How can you manipulate this stuff? That is the conversation we should be having. Right? And how do you institutionalize this in a way that it works, that we introduce some benefit of this, blah, blah, blah.
So I take a point. And so which means that if we attempt to conduct a similar evaluation in another country, another culture, then the currency will probably change.
No, not
because
at all.
the state of mind is changed.
No, well, look, it may well be, but then these things become empirical questions. So the empirical question could be, is the price list in China on well-being the same as the price list in India, is the same as the price list in Latin America, same in the UK? I'd say at a deeper level, yes, but on anything directly observable, probably not, right? Because, for instance, marriage, we know, is very important in a place like America, it's very unimportant in a place like Australia. So the effects there will differ, right? We do know that because the cultural meaning of these things will differ in terms of the price list. But in terms of saying, look, the general methodology is just going to go, right? It's just going to go through in any of these situations, and the same kind of things you will need for institutionalization. Now, let me answer I want to answer the question in the question box, which was about measures of complementarity or substitution between all kinds of areas, right? That's the classic cross-cutting stuff, right? For that, you need a framework that effectively combines various areas of government competency. Yes, exactly, competence substitutes, that is there, right? Factoring programs. For that, you will either need sort of a framework in which they are naturally together, or if they're not, if you find departments still working cross and are not so interested in some of the well-being effects on groups they don't have in their model, which will be the way, right? Let's say the prison people, they only look at the well-being of the people in prison, the prison guards, but they're not so busy with the well-being of, let's say, victims of crime, right? And somebody else cares about that. For that, you sort of need, again, your inquiries, your work groups, your white papers, basically some sort of way in order to make it a generalized framework. So in that sense, you do have an advantage because you now have an empirical measure to show what the importance is of various externalities, complements, and substitutes. But you're still, of course, have to deal with bureaucracy as it is, which is everybody's busy on specific tasks. And so you're going to set up separate systems in order to come up with solutions to joint problems. Okay, now I've got another 5 minutes or so let me do this relatively quick. The QALY, which is a concept which goes back 30 years, is a little bit like the Wellbeing. It's in fact newer than the Wellbeing, if you think of the life satisfaction question, which originated in the 1930s. The QALY is later, but it's based on physical health questions. So it's based on 5 physical health domains. Perfect health is a QALY of 1. The worst health is minus 0.59, so the states of life worse than death. And they relate, roughly speaking, an extra year of life, perfect health is 6 to 7 well-bees. We know that a year of life spent in perfect health instead of a QALY of note is worth about 2 to 3 well-bees. And so that means that the year of life changes are roughly the same, but it means that, as it were, you need almost 2.5 QALY to get 1 well-be if it's about quality of health. Right? This is effectively saying physical health, which is what the QALY measures, as quality is only about 40% of life. People just care about other stuff than their own physical health. They care about the health of their kids, they care about their social status, their standing, how well their country's doing. So that's the bottom line on that. The quality is 40% of the well-being when it comes to quality of life. When it comes to length of life, it's basically the same. So what's the bottom line on this? That the adoption of the well-being reduces the importance of physical health for policy, which is hence why the physical health people have been resisting this for decades, right? Because they see this as a threat to their budget. And it elevates the importance of mental health, so the mental health people love us, right? Social relations, so they like us, and they're championing this within the bureaucracy. And the importance of length of life is basically the same on that. So the conclusion, well-being maximization is the goal of governments. It's sort of moved from the utopia basket, in which it was for about 3 centuries, since the start of the Enlightenment, when the pursuit of happiness was in the US Constitution, but they've never done anything with that bit in the Constitution. The pursuit, the notion that government should be there for the well-being of the people, or the welfare of the people, or other phrases have been told, the greatest happiness to the greatest number, these kind of phrases, that's been said for centuries, but not been acted upon for centuries. Right? That did not lead them to ask, well, what then does make them happy? So it was in the utopia basket for a long time, and it's now in what I call its practical trial phase, right? And the well-being is sort of spear pointing that trial phase. It's intended to replace economic surplus and GDP as the primary measure of value in this internal bureaucracy that allocates money. Importantly, also, this well-being is now used in the UK, at least, and also increasingly outside of that, by small charities. So it becomes a measure of value for sports clubs, for volunteering clubs. Are we doing well for the people we're helping? Well, let's measure life satisfaction before or after. This is now a practical tool that people use for groups of 50. And the same goes for large companies. Right? You can also do this on your workers. You can do this on your clients. And that is now increasingly done. So there's a State of Life, basically non-for-profit, and they tell me, thousands of clients which now use their products as a practical tool for effectively doing well-being calculations on a weekly, monthly basis. Okay, so in terms of how are we moving the policy dial, what are we getting that we didn't get before? The current experience and definitely the long-run knowledge of well-being says, well, it's greater recognition of mental health. Mental health should get a huge boost in all kinds of ways. Social life should become much more important to policy that way in the environment. What becomes less important? The whole obsession with material goods will become less important. Right? Growth is still important, but material goods will be less important, and physical health will become less important. We'll be less obsessed with physical health, a bit more with mental health. I think that's it. So, more questions?